Logan Thorne wore the solitude like a second skin, a familiar weight he had carried since the mind collapse that had buried his friends and the man he used to be. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of a deserted stagecoach route, his existence a monotonous cycle of checking telegraph lines and fighting the encroaching emptiness. Each day bled into the next, with a dull consistency that suited him just fine. The path back to his shack was a worn groove in his life, but on this particular afternoon, a dark smudge on the horizon broke the rhythm. A congregation of vultures, too many and too still, circled with a patient, grim purpose. An instinct long suppressed by whiskey stirred within him, a relic from a time when he paid attention to the whispers of the desert. He turned his horse from the path, the animal's hooves kicking up plumes of fine, red powder. The smell of ash and something fouler hit him before he saw the full extent of the wreckage. A scorched wagon lay on its side, its wooden ribs exposed to the sky. Amidst the debris, he found her. A woman, little more than a girl, lay unconscious, her body curled against that of an older man with a single, dark hole in his chest. Her face was ashen, a stark contrast to the angry red rope burns that circled her delicate wrists. A shattered wooden crate lay nearby, its contents, gleaming medical instruments and small glass vials, scattered in the dust like fallen stars. Logan knelt, his own breath catching in his throat. He slid his arms beneath her, feeling the alarming lightness of her frame, the terrifying fragility as she lay limp against him. He stood, cradling this broken burden, and began the long walk back to his shack. The weight in his arms was solid, real, and with every step, it felt less like an anchor pulling him under, and more like something was wrenching him back, painfully and irrevocably, into the land of the living. The desert wind, usually a silent companion, now seemed to carry a new and unsettling whisper, a secret he was now burdened to keep. The cool dimness of the adobe hut offered a stark contrast to the brutal heat outside. Logan worked with a quiet efficiency, cleaning the girl's wounds with water and a ragged piece of cloth torn from his own spare shirt. He was no doctor, but years of hard living had taught him the basics of field medicine, how to stop the bleeding and ward off the infection that could be a death sentence in the desert. She stirred with a soft moan, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of dark chocolate. They darted around the small, sparse room, wide with an animalistic terror he recognized from cornered prey. When he tried to speak, to offer some semblance of comfort, she only shrank back, pressing herself against the wall. Words failed between them. She knew no English, only a handful of broken Spanish phrases. She managed to convey a name, Isabella, her voice a fragile whisper. Frustration etched her features as she tried to explain, pointing urgently toward the east, then drawing across in the thin layer of dust on the floor. Her hand then went to her throat, fingers slicing across it in a universal, chilling gesture. The message was clear, even if the details were lost. She was being hunted. The only possession he found on her was a small silver locket, hidden in the folds of her torn dress. It felt cold against his palm. He pried it open to find not a picture, but a single name engraved inside, Elena. The night stretched on, long and taut with tension. Logan sat by the single window, his Winchester resting on his knees, his ears straining to filter every night sound of the desert, the scuttle of a lizard, the sigh of the wind, the distant cry of a coyote. He watched the girl Isabella as she finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. As the first hint of dawn bled into the sky, painting the mesas in hues of rose and orange, he saw them. 3 riders on horseback, their figures dark and distinct against the pale horizon. They moved around the wreckage of the burned wagon with a slow, methodical precision that was far more unnerving than any frantic search. They wore wide-brimmed black sombreros, and their movements were fluid, almost serene, like predators who knew their quarry was nearby and time was on their side. They were not lawmen, and they lacked the reckless chaos of common bandits. This was something else, something disciplined and cold. A deep, cold certainty settled in Logan's gut. He had not just brought a victim into his home. He had brought in a storm, and the calm was already breaking. The lead rider dismounted, kneeling by the ashes. He sifted through the debris, his head tilting as he examined the ground, his gaze eventually lifting and sweeping across the landscape, passing over the hut as if it were just another rock formation. But Logan felt the weight of that unseen gaze, a prickle on the back of his neck. These men were not giving up. They were reading the story written in the sand and ash, and they were patient. He slowly lowered himself from the window, his mind racing. The shack, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, its mud brick walls suddenly thin and fragile. Every instinct told him to run, to return to the safety of his solitary existence. But then he looked at the sleeping girl, her face finally peaceful, the silver locket clutched in her hand, and he knew that path was already closed to him. The dynamite had been lit, and he was standing right next to it. The decision to take her to the nearest town, Cimarron, and seek sanctuary with the priest felt like the only logical step. The journey was long and arduous, a slow crawl through a landscape of shadows and silence. They moved only under the cover of darkness, using the deep arroyos and rocky outcrops as their highway, the moon their sole guide. During the cold, starlit hours, a fragile understanding began to weave itself between them in the absence of words. Isabella, her initial terror subsiding into a watchful wariness, started to trust him. One night, huddled around a small, shielded fire, she produced a worn, creased photograph from a hidden pocket. It showed a younger, smiling version of herself, the man from the wagon, and a woman with a kind, gentle face. Her family. With a series of gestures, her hands painting pictures in the air, she told a story of horror. She depicted men in dark clothing storming into a home, a place that was clearly in Mexico. She mimed the murder of her mother, then showed herself and her father, a doctor, being dragged away, bound and helpless. Logan listened, the pieces of her frantic drawings from the shack now forming a gruesome picture. And as he watched the raw pain in her eyes, a distant memory clicked into place. Whispers overheard in dusty saloons, tales told by drunken prospectors of a fanatical sect known as the Brotherhood of Shadow, a ghost story about an organization that kidnapped scientists and doctors for their own inscrutable ends. He had always dismissed it as frontier legend, the product of too much bad whiskey and desert sun. But now he saw the truth of it etched in the trauma of the girl beside him. The legend had a face, and it was hunting them. Their arrival in Cimarron at first light brought no relief. The town felt closed and suspicious. They found the small church on its outskirts, and Logan felt a flicker of hope as he knocked on the priest's door. The man who answered was elderly, his eyes initially holding a weary compassion. But then his gaze fell upon the silver locket that Isabella still clutched, the name Elena, clear in the morning sun. The color drained from the priest's face. Fear, stark and immediate, replaced any semblance of charity. He did not invite them in. Instead, he took a hurried step back, his hand making a swift, warding sign of the cross before he slammed the heavy door in their faces. His muffled voice came through the wood, a terrified mutter about not inviting the wrath of the faithful. The solid thud of the door was more than a rejection. It was a verdict. In that moment, the scale of the threat truly dawned on Logan. This was not a mere gang. Their influence was a poison that had seeped into the very fabric of the territory, silencing even men of God. They were everywhere. Returning to his shack was impossible. It would be the first place their hunters would look. With few options left, Logan led Isabella out of the town and up into the rugged hills, to a place he knew from his prospecting days, a played-out, abandoned mine shaft hidden on a steep slope. The darkness inside was absolute, a cold, damp void that swallowed the light. The silence was broken only by the drip of water and the ragged sound of their breathing. Isabella, shivering from cold and a fear that was now amplified by the priest's rejection, moved closer to him in the impenetrable blackness. Her small form pressed against his side, seeking warmth, seeking protection from the monsters that clearly haunted both the desert and the civilized world. His arm, moving almost of its own volition, found its way around her shoulders, pulling her into the solid warmth of his body. And as he felt her gradual stillness, the slight easing of her tremors, Logan felt something shift deep within his own chest. It was a subtle internal realignment, the first movement of a stone that had sealed him shut for 3 long years, a barrier against feeling anything at all. It did not roll away, but it cracked, and a sliver of light, or perhaps just feeling, seeped through the darkness. Their sanctuary was breached not with a shout, but with a silence. It was the abrupt cessation of the dawn birdsong that snapped Logan to full alertness, a void of sound more alarming than any war cry. He had just enough time to shove Isabella deeper into the mine's dark throat before the first bullets began to ricochet off the rusted metal frame of the entrance, the sharp pings and thuds echoing like a mad drummer in the confined space. 6 of them. They didn't rush. There was no brave, foolish charge. Instead, they laid down a methodical, punishing hail of gunfire, a storm of lead designed to pin them down, to exhaust their ammunition, or to simply shred anyone who dared peer out. Logan returned fire sparingly, each shot measured and deliberate, the stock of his Winchester cool and familiar against his cheek. Through the sights, he caught glimpses of their faces, not contorted with rage or excitement, but set in expressions of cold, detached efficiency, like butchers at a slaughter. They were patient, relentless. Then he felt a presence beside him. Isabella, her body trembling with a fear so profound it was a physical force, was crawling toward him through the dust and grit. Her hands shook as she pushed a fresh box of cartridges toward him, her movements clumsy but determined. Her eyes, when they met his, held none of the earlier, panic terror. Instead, they burned with a hard, fierce light, a will to survive that mirrored his own. She would not be a victim cowering in the dark. The stalemate stretched, minutes feeling like hours. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the damp, metallic scent of the mine. Then, Logan saw a shift in the pattern of their fire. One of the faithful was breaking away, using the covering shots to attempt a flanking maneuver, moving with a predatory grace toward a fissure in the rock that would give him a clean angle into their position. In that moment, a decision crystallized in Logan's mind, cold and clear. This was a trap, and they were the prey. He turned to Isabella, his voice a low, urgent command in the chaotic din, telling her to run, to use the narrow rear exit known only to old-time prospectors, a treacherous path that led out to the sheer hillside. Her eyes widened in protest, but he gave her a look that brooked no argument. Then he did the only thing he could. He rose to his feet, a clear target against the dim opening, and bellowed a string of crude insults into the morning air, pouring all his contempt and defiance into the words. He fired rapidly, not aiming to hit, but to draw every ounce of their attention. It worked. The gunfire outside intensified, focusing entirely on his position. A searing hot pain tore through his left shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him halfway around. A second shot whisked the hat from his head. He stumbled back, the world narrowing to the bright rectangle of the mine entrance, waiting for the final shot that would end it. But it didn't come. Instead, from behind the attackers, a new sound erupted, the sharp, distinct crack of a pistol, fired not by an expert, but with frantic urgency. One shot, then another, wild and off-target, but close enough to shatter the attackers' disciplined formation. The suppressing fire faltered as the men turned to face this unexpected threat from their rear. Using that precious second of confusion, Logan pushed through the blinding pain in his shoulder and lunged for the rear tunnel. He scrambled through the narrow, crumbling passage, the rocks tearing at his clothes, until he burst out onto the steep, rocky slope. He half ran, half fell down the incline, his vision swimming, his only thought to reach the prearranged meeting point. He found her at the dry riverbed, hidden beneath the gnarled roots of a cottonwood tree. She was kneeling, the heavy pistol still smoking in her hand, her face streaked with black powder and the clean trails of tears through the grime. But when she looked up at him, at the dark stain spreading across his shirt, there was no pity in her gaze. There was only the hard, bright fire of a fighter who had stared into the abyss and had not looked away. The wound was severe, a deep, angry tear in the muscle of his shoulder that burned with a feverish fire. In the dim, hidden cave they had found, Isabella became his sole caretaker. using torn strips from her own petticoat for bandages and water boiled over a small, discreet fire. She worked with a quiet, desperate competence. The knowledge was fragmented, half remembered from watching her father, but her hands were steady. She probed the wound with a knife heated in the flames, her jaw set, until she found and extracted the misshapen piece of lead. The days that followed were a blur of pain and delirium for Logan. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind lost in a feverish landscape haunted by the ghosts of the mine collapse and the cold faces of the faithful. Through it all, Isabella was a constant presence, cooling his brow with a damp cloth, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, and whispering words he couldn't understand, but whose tone was a lifeline. Those days of vigil changed her. The girl who had been all wide-eyed terror was gone, replaced by a woman whose eyes held a hard, flinty resolve. The experience had forged something new in her, a core of steel born from necessity and loss. When the fever finally broke and Logan's mind cleared, she began to talk. The words came slowly, a patchwork of broken English and her native Spanish, but the story they wove was horrifyingly clear. Her father had not been a willing participant. He was a doctor, a healer, and they had taken him, just as they had taken her and her mother from their home. The brotherhood, she called them, needed his skills. Their leader was a leper, a diseased old man hiding somewhere deep in the mountains, and they forced her father to concoct medicines, to try and stave off the ravages of the illness. The wagon was supposed to transport them to a new, hidden laboratory, but her father had seen a chance and taken it, a desperate bid for freedom that had cost him his life. As Logan listened, propped up against the cave wall, the simple hatred he felt for their pursuers began to transform. It solidified into something colder, more purposeful, a clear, crystalline understanding of the evil they represented. It was a corruption that reached into homes, destroyed families, and perverted the purpose of a healer for its own twisted ends. His own past, his retreat from a world after losing his friends, now seemed like a childish game, a selfish hiding from a reality that was far uglier and more demanding than he had ever allowed himself to believe. The day he was strong enough to hold his Winchester again marked a fundamental shift. He was no longer just a man trying to survive, trying to outrun a threat. He had a purpose, a target for the rage, and the resolve that now filled him. He started teaching Isabella to shoot. He showed her how to hold the heavy pistol, how to sight along the barrel, how to control her breathing and squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. She was a capable student, her movements initially hesitant but growing more confident with each spent cartridge. Her determination was a palpable force, and she learned with a fierce concentration that spoke of a deeper need than mere self-defense. Together, they became hunters. They moved like shadows, observing the patterns of their enemy. They identified one of the faithful, a man with a distinct, jagged scar across his chin, who would ride into a remote settlement for supplies. They planned their ambush in a narrow gorge, a place where the man would be vulnerable, his options limited. They waited, hidden among the rocks, the sun beating down on them. When the rider entered the trap, Logan gave a slight nod. Isabella rose from her concealment, the pistol held in both hands, its barrel aimed squarely at the man who had helped murder her parents. Logan watched her, seeing the tension in her arms, the absolute stillness of her form. He looked into her eyes, expecting to see the hot blaze of vengeance. But it wasn't there. Instead, he saw something far more formidable, a cold, unwavering certainty, a sense of justice being meted out. In that moment, as he watched her stand against the embodiment of her nightmares, Logan finally understood. He could no longer hide, not from a world, and not from the man he was meant to be. The path of the hunter was the only one left open to him. Their war was not a loud one. It was a conflict waged in whispers and shadows, a campaign of attrition rather than pitched battles. They never engaged in a frontal assault. Instead, they became a plague on the Brotherhood's operations, a persistent, unseen thorn in its side. They severed telegraph wires, isolating the sect from its contacts. They located and spoiled supply caches, leaving provisions rotting in the sun or contaminated with sand and dirt. Using his intimate knowledge of the unstable geology, Logan would trigger carefully calculated rockfalls on mountain trails, blocking crucial routes and forcing the faithful into the open, where they were more vulnerable. Logan provided the strategy and the terrain, while Isabella brought a focused fury and a surprising, innate cunning he had not expected. She could anticipate patrol routes and devise distractions with a mind that was both ruthless and clever. Soon, whispers began to circulate in the remote settlements and dusty saloons. People spoke of the ghosts of the canyon, phantoms that harassed the feared black-clad riders, and a quiet, hopeful legend began to grow. The local sheriff, who had initially viewed Logan with deep suspicion, now turned a blind eye. One morning, they found a wooden crate left conspicuously near one of their hiding spots. Inside was a small but valuable supply of cartridges, an unspoken endorsement from the law that had previously wanted nothing to do with them. Their careful, patient harassment eventually led them to the heart of the beast. After tracking a supply rider for days, they found the main encampment of the faithful, a heavily fortified ranch nestled in a remote, defensible valley deep within the mountains. A direct assault would have been nothing short of suicide. The place was a fortress, with sentries posted and clear lines of fire. But Logan remembered an old, decaying map from his prospecting days, one that detailed a network of abandoned mine shafts, long forgotten. He spent a full day scouring the ridges until he found it, the hidden entrance, partially collapsed but still passable, to a tunnel that, according to the map, ran directly beneath the main house of the ranch. The plan was set. As dusk fell, Isabella created a diversion at the far end of the valley, using dry brush and gunpowder to simulate an attempt to set fire to an outbuilding, drawing the guards' attention and manpower. Under the cover of the ensuing commotion, Logan slipped into the dark, suffocating confines of the mine tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. He moved slowly, his senses strained, until he saw a sliver of light filtering down from above through a warped floorboard. He found a trapdoor and pushed it open just enough to slide into the room above. It was a laboratory filled with the sharp, chemical smells of ether and antiseptic, crowded with glass beakers, burners, and shelves lined with dark bottles. And there, in the center of it all, sat the leader. He was a withered, ancient figure shrouded in black robes, his face hidden by a deep hood, but the gnarled, disfigured hand resting on the arm of his chair confirmed the stories of his leprosy. The old man looked up, his visible mouth twisting into a snarl, but he was helpless. Logan felt the weight of his rifle, the impulse to deliver final justice, a palpable force. But he did not raise it. Instead, his gaze swept over the shelves, over the results of the forced labor of Isabella's father. With a sudden, violent sweep of his arm, he sent the nearest table crashing to the floor, glass shattering and chemicals mixing into a toxic pool. He methodically smashed every bottle, every flask, every vial of medicine that promised the monster a continued existence. Then he took a lantern from the wall, smashed its reservoir of oil across the wooden floor and the dry papers, and threw a lit match onto the spreading pool. Fire erupted with a hungry roar, quickly climbing the walls and consuming the laboratory. He did not look back as he dropped into the tunnel and made his escape. He emerged on the hillside to see the ranch's main house becoming a brilliant pyre against the night sky, a symbol of tyranny being consumed by its own flames. Below, chaos reigned, the faithful their prophet and their purpose literally going up in smoke, milled in panic, their discipline shattered. Without their leader and the reason for their cruel mission, their organization crumbled into nothing. They scattered into the darkness, no longer a unified threat. Several months later, Logan and Isabella stood at the threshold of his old shack. But it was no longer the refuge of a hermit. The walls had been reinforced, a new room added, and the roof freshly patched. By the entrance, they had planted a row of resilient cacti, their green flesh a promise of blooms to come with the spring. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the canyon in deep shades of crimson and purple, Isabella reached out and took his hand. Her palm was rough from work, calloused and strong, but its grasp was warm and certain. Logan looked at her, at the home they had built from the ashes of their pasts, and he understood. The desert, which had once been a grave for his spirit, had finally given him a chance at life. He had saved her from bullets and captivity, and in return, she had saved him from the slow death of solitude and regret. In that harsh and unforgiving world, that simple, hard-won truth was more than enough. It was everything.